Part 3 of this video is about how we solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So up until now, we've been taking expressions like this and rewriting them by completing the square. And now we're going to use that strategy to solve a quadratic equation. Now, maybe you already were looking at this equation and you see that it can be factored. And because the left-hand side, we factored it and it equals 0, we have two things that we're multiplying that equal 0, so either one of those things has to be 0 or the other has to be 0. That's the zero product property. And of course, you can solve this equation or each of these little equations using the properties of equality to come up with this solution. So we don't need a new strategy to solve this problem, but I wanted to demonstrate this strategy with a problem that we already know how to solve so that we see that we'll get the same answer. So over here, I'll take that same equation, and then notice, in order to, if we look at this middle term, we know that if we split that in half, we're going to have 1x. And if I square that 1, I get 1. So my perfect square is going to be x squared plus 2x plus 1. But I have a negative 8. So what I have to do on this with this expression is I have to add 1 and then subtract 9 so that, again, I'm splitting this minus 8 into a plus 1 and a minus 9 so that I have my perfect square and then some constant term. And so when I factor, I get this. And now I can add 9 to both sides, and I get this relationship. And this is the value of completing the square here. You see, the whole left side of my equation is squared, so I could square root the whole left side of my equation. Of course, I would also have to square root the right side of my equation, which is no problem here because 9 is also a perfect square, or a square number. And I get this. If I square root both sides, I have to consider the positive and the negative square root of 9. That's 3 and negative 3. And then I can solve each of these little equations by just subtracting 1 from both sides. Subtraction property of equality. And I get the same solution. I might put it in a different order over here, but either way, same two values of x. So solving with this strategy gives me the same answer as solving with factoring, which is promising, of course, because there are only two solutions to this equation, and regardless of our strategy, we should get the same answer. So let's look at a problem now that you can't solve very easily by factoring, like this one. So my strategy here is going to be complete the square on the left-hand side, and notice, I hope you're getting pretty good at this now, but if you split the 6 into 3 and 3 x's, then you square that 3, you get 9. So if this is to be a perfect square, then this 5 has to be a 9. And so what I really need to do is add 4 to it. And if I add 4 to the left-hand side of my equation, I also have to add 4 to the right-hand side of my equation. That is the addition property of equality. And specifically, we used the addition property of equality to complete the square. And we get this version of our equation. And so now I can factor the left-hand side, and notice the value of completing the square. My entire left-hand side of my equation is being squared, so I can square root both sides of this equation. And taking the square root of 13 that's an irrational number, so I just write it as the square root of 13. But I also got to consider the negative square root of 13, just as we did 3 and negative 3 in our last example. So now it's just about the properties of equality, the subtraction property of equality specifically. I'm subtracting 3 both sides. Oops, there's a typo in my slide. This should be right here, this should be a minus. negative 3 minus root 13. So that's how you solve um, a quadratic equation by completing the square that's not easily factorable. And you can see you would have had a hard time factoring this thing with the root 13 in it. But um, now you can go on, and here's some exercises. You can try to solve these equations by completing the square. And if you uh, pause the video right now and work out at least a few of these problems in your problem journal. And here are the solutions. And you'll notice there are a few that do not have solutions because you're expected to take the square roots of negative numbers in C, for example. And we don't have a way to do that yet, so we just say there's no solution.